Chosen one, look at you, showing up unshaken, carrying more power than you even realize. This isn't an accident. You're not here by chance. You didn't stumble into this moment. You were built for it. Welcome to the ones who refuse to shrink. The ones who walk in and the whole vibe shifts. The ones who made it through what should have broken them and still stand like they own the place, because you do. This is your reminder. You're not ordinary. You're the spark they didn't see coming. You're the reason they can't stop watching. You're the proof that resilience has a face, and it's yours. So take a breath. Stand taller. Forget the doubts, the whispers, the fake rules. You've already survived more than enough to know. You're not just participating anymore. You are the moment. Now let's get into it. Some moments imprint themselves like the scent of smoke after a fire, impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away. The quiet shift was subtle at first, like the air before a storm, yet it unsettled everything familiar. Conversation started circling, not because of announcements or grand gestures, but because the silence carried more weight than noise ever could. Looking for purpose and peace? Hit subscribe and start the journey. A change unfolded in plain sight, as if the ground beneath their routines turned soft and unfamiliar, and nothing about the old maps applied anymore. Without ceremony or permission, a boundary was crossed. What they once believed to be unshakable suddenly seemed fragile, as though they'd been living in houses of sand. While others busied themselves with small distractions, the transformation took on the force of an unexpected tide, reshaping the shore without seeking approval. Faces turned, not to celebrate but to measure what they could no longer predict, to reconcile a version of reality that no longer matched the story they'd been telling. The shift didn't just redraw one life, it revealed the fault lines in others. Where chaos clung and noise multiplied, it only highlighted what they feared to see reflected back. It wasn't merely conversation that echoed through their rooms. It was the sound of a fragile balance collapsing under its own weight. Their unease was not just gossip, but a frantic search for an explanation, a way to stitch back together what no longer fit. What looked like chatter was really the rustle of fear, the quiet confession that someone else's rising had disturbed the fragile architecture they thought would hold forever. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. Change arrives like an unwelcome audit to lives content with illusions, revealing corners left dusty, truths left unspoken, words scattered to distract from the weight of what has been uncovered, because silence would mean confronting their own choices. What once seemed below their notice has risen beyond their reach, unraveling the stories they whispered to soothe themselves. No surface was flipped, yet everything once leaning on that fragile balance toppled when the center no longer held still. That quiet ascent became a spark none of them expected. Not the victory itself, but the shadow it cast, stretching across everything they avoided acknowledging. It wasn't the shine that unsettled them. It was the way it illuminated the gaps they pretended not to see. There was no need for boasting, yet the shift was impossible to disguise. Without intent, the transformation exposed how long others stood idle, how much time they squandered crafting excuses instead of progress. Struggle had been their measuring stick. As long as it lingered elsewhere, they felt taller. Now the scale is gone, and the mirror they meet each morning reflects what they'd rather keep hidden. No contest was waged, but still a quiet victory revealed itself, and that contradiction gnawed at everything they believed about themselves. Some had never hoped for flourishing. They simply prayed the roots would remain shallow enough to keep them comfortable. When silence turned into strength, and wandering turned into direction, the atmosphere thickened. Renewal carried a quiet tension, because healing speaks louder than chaos ever could. The more focus sharpened, the more the distractions of others became impossible to ignore, and that kind of reflection is rarely welcome. Reactions waver between forced praise and veiled resentment, as though congratulating through clenched teeth could soften what they fear is irreversible. Different becomes their favorite accusation, but behind that word lies discomfort, an inability to recognize the person they can no longer diminish. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor his kingdom. May his grace guide you always. What blossomed became a contrast they couldn't deny. Serenity exposing disorder, momentum revealing inertia. The moment progress outgrew the walls around it. The village felt smaller, yet claimed betrayal. They called it switching sides, but it was only a refusal to remain bound by an outdated script. Independence unsettled them because it no longer asked for their permission or approval. Standards rose quietly, rules were left behind, and that shift spoke louder than any declaration ever could. This wasn't rebellion, it was arrival. Familiarity was easier to embrace when the quiet version stayed contained, asking no questions, taking up little space, blending neatly into the expectations of others. That version never disrupted illusions or forced anyone to confront the ceilings they'd built above themselves. Its compliance allowed them to feel taller without changing anything in their own lives. When the ambition finally refused to stay buried, when boundaries were drawn and shallow praise no longer satisfied, a quiet discomfort rippled through every room it entered. The decision to choose stillness over appeasement, clarity over chaos, and direction over stagnation unsettled more than it inspired. Many use the word loyalty but mean something closer to obedience. Remain unchanged, predictable, harmless. They speak of unity while hoping the pieces never move out of place. When that unspoken arrangement dissolved, the quiet disapproval surfaced, not because harm was done, but because healing arrived uninvited, rewriting roles they'd grown comfortable in. That kind of dignity unsettles those who've relied on doubt to feel secure. No rupture of pride drove the departure, only the need to breathe beyond walls too narrow for growth. Words tangle and accusations circle to disguise what everyone already senses. Nothing was abandoned except the willingness to keep pretending. For some, disdain was never personal. It was structural. Their confidence rested on the idea of having something to resist, someone to define themselves against. Mockery, dismissal, and gossip became the scaffolding that held up their fragile sense of place. When the narrative shifted and the figure they used as a mirror began to change shape, the entire structure trembled. Careful observation disguised itself as criticism, but every judgment carried a secret admiration for the courage to step where they wouldn't. They rehearsed opposition to inflate their own standing, and without that counterweight, their purpose began to unravel. What was once dismissed as noise became undeniable because silence carried further than any defense. Achievements struck not because they were loud, but because they were steady. Each quiet decision chipped away at the false identity others had clung to, revealing that their greatest fear wasn't defeat, but irrelevance in the face of someone else's becoming. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. Attention lingers where identity feels fragile. Some find themselves unable to turn away because their sense of self was stitched together by watching another's every step, measuring their worth against someone else's movement. Once the familiar rivalry dissolved, they were left exposed, unsure how to define themselves without the reflection of someone they could dismiss. When the conflict was left behind, silence became deafening. No more arguments to feed on, no more resistance to validate their story, only their own neglected wounds staring back. The illusion that rules protected them began to crack, and what was once called discipline revealed itself as a quiet cage built to keep the daring subdued. What looked like rebellion was nothing more than clarity. Simple questions disrupted what generations had agreed never to question. Traditions crumbled under scrutiny, not because of malice, but because they had never been rooted in truth. That clarity became dangerous, not in action, but in presence, exposing the fragility of everything they called order. No commands were broken, no promises betrayed. Simply stepping outside the lines forced others to see those lines for what they really were: brittle fences painted gold. Watching someone leave what they called home made their familiar path feel more like a trap than a refuge. Whispers multiplied to rewrite the story into something easier to digest, calling independence arrogance, labeling conviction instability. But beneath the noise, they knew it was neither chaos nor rebellion. It was simply liberation that could no longer be hidden. The departure shook them because it revealed what they refused to face: The sanctuary they clung to was nothing more than a quiet prison. And once one pair of eyes saw beyond it, others began to wonder if they too had mistaken walls for safety. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. What frightened them most wasn't the defiance, it was the survival. What unsettled them wasn't the voice, it was the vision that refused to dim. The collapse they counted on never came, and the silence they expected stretched into something stronger, louder than any shout. They never anticipated a return, certainly not a triumphant one. They thought the fall was permanent, the flame extinguished for good. But the story they rehearsed ended too soon, and they were unprepared for the moment the ashes stirred and became something they could no longer ignore. Defiance took shape quietly, standing tall without waiting for validation, without clinging to the weight of wounds others expected to keep you crawling. No applause needed, no permission sought, and still, the ground shifted underfoot. Survival was never the destination, it was only the beginning. Many assumed you'd remain fractured, just enough to keep breathing, but never whole enough to move freely. What they didn't see coming was the way that survival sharpened into vision, how stillness gave way to resolve, how quiet endurance became a force that refused to be contained. What emerged dismantled every low expectation whispered in the dark. They anticipated collapse and instead witnessed something unshakable take form, not handed, but carved in the unseen hours. Amid struggles no one dared to look at too closely. That strength was not inherited. It rose from silence that felt endless, from moments where only something beyond comprehension could hold you upright. What came next was not a climb but a rising, unforced, undeniable. Now, the ones who bet against it choke on the realization that not only did you endure, but you now thrive in ways they can't even name. The very presence of that transformation unsettles the rooms it enters, not out of arrogance, but because the mere fact of it speaks louder than words ever could. This living testament unsettles those who built themselves on doubt. It proves that dismissal doesn't dictate destiny, that fractures don't finish a story, and that quiet faith outweighs public doubt every time. What they wanted as a cautionary tale instead became a turning point, not their vindication, but their reckoning. Even now they scramble to rewrite what happened, because the truth makes their roles too obvious. Their fixation on you is less about you than about them. Every whispered remark is a failed attempt to process their own disappointments, to avoid the questions your existence forces them to consider. Your name has become their escape, a place to deposit resentment, regret, envy they refuse to acknowledge. They cloak it in analysis and gossip, but it leaks insecurity and confession in every syllable. Each word they throw your way is more about their reflection than your reality. They use your boldness to explain their hesitations, your strength to justify their retreat, your success to excuse their stagnation. Blaming your journey distracts them from noticing their own. They would rather dissect your choices than face the silence of their own unmade ones. In rooms you've never walked into, they gather just to circle around your name, not because they understand you, but because they can't bear to sit alone with themselves. Presence can weigh heavier than words. Without speaking, without defending, without even showing up, you remain the center of their inner reckoning, a silent thread weaving through their thoughts as they struggle to untangle themselves. The chapters you've lived carry more force than explanations ever could. That quiet transformation forced others to notice what they'd been avoiding, a confrontation they never asked for but couldn't escape. No one signs up to become a reflection others use to gauge themselves against. Yet somehow, without trying, you became the surface they measure their own unspoken regrets upon. It wasn't just old wounds you refused to inherit. It was the entire system that insisted you carry them. Breaking the weight meant revealing not only the damage, but also who kept passing it down as though it were a treasured inheritance. People love the idea of change until it starts knocking at their door, until someone stops agreeing to the rules written in silence. until someone refuses to swallow what's been force-fed for generations. That's when murmurs begin, not from strangers, but from those closest, whose comfort depended on your compliance. Healing never remains private when it exposes what others pretend not to see. Setting boundaries unmasked manipulation they swore didn't exist. Choosing calm stripped the mask off traditions designed to keep everyone quiet. Turning away from the familiar made you the villain in a play you never auditioned for. Not because you betrayed them, but because you made it impossible for them to pretend nothing was wrong. Some of the same hands that once claimed to hold you up felt safer when you stayed fractured. So long as you stayed in pieces, the fragile balance of their world stayed intact. But when the silence broke, when you dared to challenge favoritism, shame, and those unwritten hierarchies, everything shifted. Because silence is what holds such families together, and breaking it was the real revolution. Your eyes forced accountability where it had never existed. Proof that the hurt could have stopped long before, had someone simply chosen differently. Instead of owning that, they made you the problem, called you fragile, angry, ungrateful, anything but honest. You dared to do what they wouldn't. And their whispers aren't about your fall, they're about your escape. Every step you take toward freedom confronts them with the reality that they too had a choice, and chose to stay. What they call gossip is closer to study. Every word exchanged about you isn't fueled by hate, so much as by hunger. For an answer, a way out, a map. You became more than a name. You became a field guide, a living proof that what was said to be impossible could, in fact, be done. They watch because you reveal more than their comfort can handle. Proof that healing dismantles everything built on appearances. And that realization cuts deeper than anything spoken aloud, because they're not really observing you. They're watching themselves in the reflection of what you dared to become. Some watch not to imitate, but to understand. Caught between wonder and regret, they study every step like it holds a secret they missed. What baffles them isn't your style, but your survival. How you walked through the same storm and emerged unbroken, intact where they still splinter. Your existence challenges what they told themselves was impossible. From the same wreckage, you created something unrecognizable. While they stalled, you moved. While they made excuses, you rebuilt. Now they pick apart what you do, not always out of malice, but because they can't stop asking where they went wrong while you were quietly reshaping what they believed was permanent. What once fueled their conversations was the idea of you stumbling. Your setbacks were their favorite story to tell, passed from mouth to mouth like prized secrets. Every misstep of yours became a kind of currency they traded in to feel less stuck. But then something shifted. You refused to carry shame for them to feed on. You stopped shrinking to fit their narrative, stopped hiding pieces they twisted for their entertainment. You claimed everything and left them grasping at nothing. They had built whole rooms, whole rituals, on the idea you'd stay small, that you'd flinch under their whispers, that you'd keep quiet so they could keep pretending. Instead, you spoke, you stood, you exposed the silence for what it was. What they never expected was for you to stop apologizing, for the shadows, for the scars, for the chapters they tried to hold over you. By bringing your story into the open, you stripped away their leverage and made their stories irrelevant. The version of you they used to profit from no longer exists. They've been left scrambling to find a new script because the old one no longer fits. Without your silence to weaponize, their entire stage crumbles. When you walked into rooms as yourself, unmasked, unedited, something in the air changed. You didn't come to expose anyone. You didn't light fires or point fingers. You simply arrived, and that was enough to make what was false start to collapse. The facade began to crack because authenticity makes pretense impossible to sustain. One by one, the personas they'd worn melted away in the presence of someone unwilling to perform. They rehearsed strength, happiness, and loyalty as though those could be performed convincingly. But the moment someone real entered, their lines faltered. You didn't speak against them. You didn't fight them. You simply existed, and that existence became the quiet storm they could not contain. Some cannot maintain the illusion when faced with someone who no longer needs one. They could perform for everyone else, but not for the presence that came from depth rather than ego. Truth has a way of stripping away pretenses without speaking a word. What revealed them wasn't accusation or conflict, but the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. That stillness disrupted everything they'd staged and left them scrambling to reassemble an identity. Each movement left a mark they couldn't erase, not because of grand gestures, but because authenticity lingers where facades collapse. They keep weaving new stories to reclaim control, but the cracks in the image remain. Without pointing or naming names, simply existing in integrity shattered the fantasy they'd built. What they pretended to be disintegrated next to what you simply were. And now they gather fragments of what you embody, trying to imitate what can't be borrowed. The weight of presence unsettled the room because it was too real for the script they rehearsed. Masks fell, roles dissolved, and what remained was one figure still standing after the ashes settled. Not because of ambition, but because of refusal to bend. They don't truly want your life. The symbols and achievements mean little to them. What they crave is the quiet liberation that radiates from someone who broke loose from the expectations they still cling to. What unsettles them isn't material. It's the way nothing external owns you anymore. How dismissive glances roll off you. How you choose your steps without apology. That level of detachment feels foreign to those still bound to appearances. They try to mimic the surface, but can't replicate the depth. While they're still tied to approval and image, your silence echoes louder than their noise. You slipped out of roles, discarded the scripts, and became something they can't touch. Their discomfort doesn't stem from envy of what you have, but from witnessing what they've denied themselves. Watching someone stop performing, stop pretending, stop shrinking forces them to feel the weight of their own compromises. Not anger, not coldness, but a kind of calm that can't be bought. It unsettles them because it whispers of what they could have been if they'd chosen differently. They watch you move in ways they can't explain, choosing honesty over compliance, walking away when dignity demands it, standing firm where they would have folded. That's what gnaws at them, not the success itself, but the freedom inside it. They tried to define you by your struggles, but couldn't cage you in them. They thought control came from shaming your past, but you claimed it instead and left them powerless. The silence you now inhabit speaks volumes, proof that you don't need to win arguments or dominate rooms to reclaim yourself. They could also walk away from the chains they wear, but they won't. Freedom would cost them the stories they still cling to, so they scoff at what they can't grasp and whisper about what they're too afraid to do. But inside they know. The reason they keep watching is because you've become a reminder of how trapped they still are. Some energies arrive and rearrange the air without effort. Even silent, they ripple through a space, unsettling what was hidden, pulling back what others worked so hard to keep buried. What moves is not volume but presence, unshakable, unbending, and unwilling to dim. Even without speaking, something changes. People adjust their words mid-sentence. They check their posture. They second-guess what they rehearse to say. Not because of intimidation, but because authenticity has a way of making everything artificial feel heavier. Stillness can feel like a weight to those who rely on noise to drown their own unease. Calmness disorients anyone who thrives by controlling others. What fills the room isn't domination. It's a demand for honesty so quiet and steady that few can remain untouched. Some shrink. Some overcompensate. Others retreat entirely, but no one walks away unaffected. That quiet force doesn't come from ego or applause, but from scars carried without spectacle, battles endured without witnesses. It isn't just there. It moves through the room, loosening what's false. When it arrives, lies lose their confidence. Masks slip. Pretenses tremble, not because of conflict, but because truth refuses to play along. What unsettles others is not noise, but the pressure of something real in a space designed for performances. Few know how to respond, so they give it names. Too intense, too much, because that feels safer than admitting it shifted them. The energy carried isn't merely personal. It feels older, larger, impossible to explain, as though it belongs to something ancestral, something sacred. What they experience isn't fear of a person, but resistance to what's being awakened in themselves. Every false layer grows restless under its gaze. It doesn't seek to create chaos, yet it disrupts. Not dramatic, but catalytic. Discomfort is inevitable where illusions are strong. Some wish it would dim, but it doesn't ask for permission. The presence alone reveals what others hoped would remain hidden. And those who can't handle it aren't running from you. They're running from the truth you made impossible to ignore. Sometimes it isn't the loudest reaction that leaves the deepest impact, but the quiet that arrives and changes everything beneath the surface. It moves unnoticed, unannounced, dismantling what cannot withstand it, not with shouting, but with the steady gravity of transformation. While others expected explosions, what came instead was far more permanent. While they waited for chaos, what they got was a quiet rising that left the ground itself unrecognizable.